We are now in our fourth Shabbat that we've had in our homes. And I'm so grateful and glad that we can find each other this way, because I know that not being together in person is very hard for all of us. And so tonight I want to spend a few moments just reflecting with you as we prepare to enter Pesach, this very sacred time, which I know will be a very challenging time also for many of us as we are separated from our loved ones and in isolation. We determined that the Torah that we would share on Friday evenings before Shabbat would generally be very short and sweet, so that people could go and finish their preparation for Shabbat. But this is Shabbat HaGadol, so I have an excuse to speak a little bit longer than we typically will on these Friday nights, because there's an important message that I want to share with us. And so this is called Passover in a time of pandemic. In the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus, we learn that the Israelites went on their journey toward freedom. 600,000 men, probably an equal number of women, many children, and many elderly. We imagine that there were about 2 million people in total. And they went up out of the enslavement in Egypt, and they brought their matzah with them. They left in such haste that they did not even have time for the bread to rise. And they left after hundreds of years of oppression and degradation, and they began on their journey toward freedom. And then the text tells us in chapter 12, verse 42, that it was for the Lord a night of vigil to bring them out of the land of Egypt. That night is called Leil Shimurim, Seder night, the night that we now mark at the beginning of Passover, a night of vigil or a night of watching. There's a machloket, a dispute that comes in the Talmud in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, page 11b, for those who want to look, a dispute between two rabbis, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer, about what it means that this is called Leil Shimurim, a night of watching. Rabbi Yoshua says that this meant that this night, that first night of Passover, was a night that was guarded and kept and preserved throughout the generations as a night in which redemption would be possible, not only for our ancestors back in Egypt, but for all of us for all time. In other words, Leil Shimurim means a night in which miracles are possible. And that's first and foremost what we are called to hold on the first evening of Passover. But Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he says that Leil Shimurim is actually a night of watching. It is a night on which we will be watched by God, guarded and protected by God from whatever evil is around us. So at the essence of this dispute is the question of what the message of Passover fundamentally is. Does the message of Passover hold with it the promise of redemption or the promise of the protection from harm? Both of these hold risk and both of them hold promise. And as many of you know, at the heart of my Jewish life is the notion that this night is a night of redemption, a redemption that was not a one-time event, the event of our ancestors leaving Egypt, but a story that offers the world a new redemptive paradigm, a story that would signal for all time that liberation and redemption are in fact possible, a reminder that our ancestors journeyed, as our rabbis tell us, me'avdut lecherut, me'yagon lesimcha, me'evel liyom tov, me'afela le'or gadol, me'shibud le'geula, that they traveled from enslavement to freedom, from anguish to joy, from devastation to celebration, from darkness to light, from slavery to freedom. Seder, in my mind, compels us to remember that we have seen terrible darkness before, that we've been imprisoned and we've been enslaved. We have been deported, we've been dehumanized, our holy sites have been desecrated, we have been surrounded before by devastation and destruction. And we are called to remember for all time that our story does not end in darkness, because ours is a journey me'afela le'ora, from darkness to light. We learned this when we left Egypt and headed for the promised land thousands of years ago. And we held on to this truth when we were murdered and exiled and enslaved in the year 70 CE. We fought to remember this message through hundreds of years of expulsions and pogroms. We whispered this truth to one another in the barracks after days in the slave labor camps. The reminder of this journey, Yetziat Mitzrayim, has held us and strengthened us and breathed life back into us in the darkest of times. And it's especially important in days like the ones that we're living through today, that we remember that long, beautiful, promising ascent from Egypt to the promised land, that we remember that our story insists that we will get there, not immediately, not in a week, not necessarily in a month or even in a few months, but we will get there because our journey is on a trajectory from narrowness to expansiveness and from darkness to light. We tell this story in order to build the muscle memory for survival, to create a sense of hope that can lift us through even the darkest of times. And this is why, facing liquidation in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jews prepared for Seder. This is why the prisoners in the death camp stole flour in order to try to make matzah on Passover. This is why in Bergen-Belsen, the prisoners whispered memorized verses of the Haggadah to one another. This story tells us we have been here before. Do you remember? And one day we will again walk from darkness to light. And this is why Michael Walzer, the great political theorist, says that the Exodus story is almost ubiquitous. It's not only a sacred story for us in the Jewish community, but wherever people know the Bible and have experienced oppression, he says, the Exodus has sustained spirits and inspired resistance. This story is the closest thing there is to the genetic transmission of hope, the rarest and the most precious commodity in times of darkness, like today. Because we human beings desperately need a redemption narrative today. So this year, and every year, we sit down to Seder and we say, maybe this night will be the beginning of a new chapter. Maybe this will be the beginning of the turning of the tide toward redemption. That is the message of Passover, according to Rabbi Yehoshua. But this year, I can also hear the voice of Rabbi Eliezer saying that there is another side to the story that we desperately need to hear. Rabbi Eliezer asks us to consider, what if Passover at its core is not about redemption, but is about protection? What if the core idea of this holiday is that there is one night a year in which we hold the full awareness of the danger that's around us, and there's always danger around us, but we're not afraid, symbolized by the opening of the door at the end of the Seder meal? What if we say we will not be defined tonight by fear? We will have faith that somehow we will be protected from whatever enemies and dangers and threats are around us and beside us. Look, I'm afraid. I've been afraid since this thing started. I'm afraid to buy groceries, and I'm afraid to send someone else out to get them for me and my family. I'm afraid that I'm going to one day make the wrong call for Ikar for our community, and that our gatherings might lead to people getting sick. I've been afraid that I'm going to hurt someone by not showing up by their side and breaking the rules just to hug them in their time of need. I'm afraid that my parents are going to get sick and that I'm not going to be able to care for them. I'm afraid that this crisis is going to strip our community and our city and our world bare, and in desperation, people are going to start to turn on one another. I'm afraid that my kids are losing their childhood innocence to a crisis that could bring out the very worst in all of us. But if Rabbi Eliezer's right, Seder is one night for us not to be afraid, a night to take those very real fears and to affirm that we will not be dominated or defined by fear, a night to lift up amid the haze of grief and loss, the loss of loved ones, the loss of love, the loss of opportunities and wages and job security, the loss of savings, the loss of donations, the loss of dreams, the loss of college graduations and proms and b'nai mitzvah, things that can't come back, that even with all of that loss, we are not completely lost. But the blessing of freedom is that we still have the ability, each one of us, to reclaim some agency, even when so much has been taken from us. In a pandemic, we don't get to make a lot of choices. We can't choose where to eat, whose Seder table we're going to sit at this year. But we can choose to take a break from fear for one night, and instead to reflect on all that we've learned over these past couple of weeks already, like how much community matters, which I'm reminded of in Zoom Shibbas almost every night for the last couple of weeks. It's like what a blessing real friends are. Like the fact that health crises disproportionately poor and the elderly, and the fact that the judge of a society is not how we treat the richest and most powerful, but how we care for the most vulnerable. And the undeniable truth that when profit and political expedience supersede moral responsibility, every one of us pays the price. What would it mean to have one night without fear dominating our hearts and our minds as we walk through this time? When we can take hold of the awareness that we are all connected by an invisible web of humanity that stretches across land and sea, that teaches us that teachers deserve to be paid a lot more. And so do the folks who clean our homes and our offices, that medical professionals are superheroes who are disguised as regular people, that FaceTime Scrabble with grandparents is maybe one of the very best ways to spend an evening, that we are all responsible for one another, that norms can shift quickly for better and for worse, that we all need to work to build our resiliency tools, that we can live with a lot less than we might have thought we could, that the world is really, really small, that our bodies are precious and touch is sacred and ought never be taken for granted, that breathing helps, and so does prayer, and that there's still beauty everywhere. What will we do with this newfound awareness? This is an expression of agency. You can't have agency if you are frozen in fear. So this year, I am holding Passover as both a night of redemption, as Rabbi Yeshua said, and a night free from fear, as Rabbi Eliezer said, because this year I need both. And this year we need both. Our routines have been upended. Our lives have been put on hold. We and our loved ones are profoundly vulnerable, and yet we are still here. Passover in the time of pandemic calls us to transform this hour of collective terror into a time of collective awakening, to let our vulnerability and our awareness become the anchor in the storm, a reminder of the power of faith and shared commitment, both of which we are going to need desperately, not only to get through this, but when all of this is over, as we lift one another off the floor and work together to build a society of radical accountability, rooted in equity and equality, in justice and dignity, and most of all, in love. So this year, amid all of the devastation and the destruction, I pray that we are able to temporarily set aside our fear and reclaim the dream of redemption that has stood at the heart of our shared story for thousands of years. This year, I pray that we embrace the desperate human need, both for protection and for redemption. May it be a Passover of hope and comfort and great meaning for all of us. Shabbat Shalom.